When Jessica reached the grave, the fresh, damp smell of the soil filled her nose. The newly dug earth seemed to weigh heavily on her heart, refreshing the sorrowful memories of recent days. She slowly placed the white lilies on her father's grave. As she carefully positioned each flower, it was as if she was filled with a longing to be beside her father. Bending down, she rested her hands on the tombstone, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. As she quietly murmured her prayers, the cemetery's eerie silence began to seep deeper into her being. The air was heavy. It was a moment when even the birds were silent. As she neared the end of her prayers, she suddenly heard a rustling sound from behind her. Her breath caught in her throat, and her entire body froze for a moment. The unexpected sound made her heart race. She quickly turned around, trying to focus her eyes on the darkness. She looked between the gravestones and the old trees, but saw no one. Smiling to herself, she attributed the unsettling feeling to her exhaustion and the stress she had been under in recent days. Yet, the unease lingered. It felt as though something was hidden in the dark corners of the cemetery. Jessica turned back to the tombstone, but now she was filled with an urgent desire to leave as quickly as possible. As she was about to leave the cemetery, Jessica's sense of unease intensified. As she walked silently between the gravestones, she was suddenly jolted by a voice echoing in her ears. This time, a whisper, deep and cold, clearly said her name, "Jessica." The whisper was so distinct, it felt as if someone had leaned in and spoken directly into her ear, far beyond what the wind could carry. Her skin prickled with fear, and her heart seemed to leap out of her chest. Within seconds, her entire body was consumed by panic, and she quickened her steps, desperately trying to leave the cemetery. But no matter how fast she moved, the voice kept pace with her. The ominous whisper echoed in her ears, matching each of her steps. Here's the translation of the passage into English, while maintaining the integrity of the meaning. Jessica. The voice grew closer, as if it was right behind her. Jessica involuntarily glanced over her shoulder, but all she saw before her were the dark cemetery and intertwining shadows. The whisper seemed to swirl around her, as if trying to pull her deeper into the cemetery. She quickened her pace, but with each step, the voice pierced her heart more deeply. When she looked back, she encountered a dark silhouette emerging from the depths of the cemetery. The figure moved silently between the gravestones, blending with the shadows. At first, Jessica thought it was an illusion, a trick of the darkness. However, as the figure slowly approached, she could hardly believe her eyes. Taking a few steps forward to examine the silhouette more closely, her breath caught in her throat. It looked like her father's silhouette, but it carried a strange and foreign aura. Instead of the warm, reassuring face she remembered, there was deep anger in his eyes, and his pale grey skin reflected the coldness of death. This was not her father's spirit, but the form of a ghost filled with anger and vengeance. A chilling fear gripped Jessica. She couldn't take her eyes off the silhouette, but every part of her was screaming to flee. Her hands trembling, she took a few steps back, her heart filled with terror. You're not him," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. Even as the words escaped her lips, they couldn't suppress the fear she felt inside. But the ghost, as if not hearing her words, continued to glide toward her. With each step, the air around her grew colder. As Jessica retreated, the ghost's vacant eyes were fixed on her, as if wanting to draw her soul away. The ghost's voice echoed in Jessica's ears like a deep and haunting hum resonating throughout the cemetery. "They left me alone," the ghost said, as if speaking from both a distant place and right beside her. The tone of the voice carried the accumulated pain and frustration of years. It was an intense sense of loneliness and abandonment that the living would find hard to comprehend. A deep fear enveloped Jessica as each word of the voice seemed to penetrate her very soul. The anger and sorrow on the ghost's face were reflections of a power not of this world. "The time for revenge has come," the ghost said, its voice growing darker and continuing to echo through the cemetery. These words spread through the darkness between the gravestones, as if each one was heavy enough to close in on Jessica. The darkness of the cemetery intensified with the ghost's threat, and the air around her grew colder. Jessica could feel the strength of the vengeful spirit's desire for retribution. It was not just the anger of a ghost. It was the deep-seated hatred of a forgotten soul, the echo of its incomplete life and abandonment by death. As Jessica tried to retreat in terror, the darkness of the cemetery seemed to press down on her. She struggled to find the narrow paths between the gravestones, stumbling with each step on the slippery ground. In the darkness, she realized that not only was the ghost's frightening silhouette visible, but now other ghosts were appearing as well. These spirits seemed to glide from the depths of the cemetery, like a cold wind rising from underground. Here's the translation of the passage into English, while maintaining the integrity of the meaning. Each of them, with their pale faces, became more distinct in the cemetery's misty and ancient atmosphere. Their eyes carried deep traces of pain and anger, as if they were trying to penetrate Jessica's very soul. These ghosts were souls long forgotten and not remembered by anyone. Some of the ghosts still wore tattered remnants of old clothing, while others bore the marks of a completely erased past. The spirits surrounded Jessica, approaching her with their empty eyes gleaming with a desire for revenge. Each ghost was a part of its own tragic story, and they all sought justice by making their presence felt in this world. As Jessica scanned these spirits with her eyes, her heart raced so fast it felt like it might give out. The darkness and fear among the spirits created a chilling silence throughout the cemetery. Jessica felt the whispering voices of revenge growing even closer within this silence. As Jessica ran in panic toward the cemetery exit, the darkness around her grew more intense. The frightening words whispered by the ghosts seemed to envelop her like a physical weight. "You can't escape us," they said, their voices rising from the depths of the cemetery like an echo, appearing in every corner. These words intensified Jessica's fear, causing her to quicken her steps. The gravestones and ground seemed to move against her. Some stones were toppled, others scattered. With each step, the ground felt as though it was collapsing beneath her, and the indistinct shadows on the stones posed a threat. Jessica's heart was filled with terror, pounding in her chest. Her breath was shallow, and her mouth felt dry with every intake of air. Reaching the cemetery gate, Jessica paused for a moment and looked back. The light in front of the gate seemed like a beacon of hope, but behind it, the ghosts were closing in rapidly. Her eyes were followed by hollow eyes shining out of the darkness, filled with pale faces. The movements of the ghosts had become dense like a fog, each of them approaching Jessica as if to catch her at any moment. Struggling to cope with this horrifying scene, Jessica accelerated her steps. She felt as if she was on the verge of reaching the gate, but the darkness behind the ghosts made her feel as though she was rooted to the spot. As she ran toward the gate, the darkness around her deepened, and the hum of the ghosts filled her ears. She could almost feel the cold breath of the approaching spirits on her skin. But suddenly, from one of the dark corners of the cemetery, her father's ghost stepped forward, blocking the path between her and the other spirits. Standing like a barrier among the pale and angry faces, the ghost of her father obstructed Jessica's way. His eyes momentarily returned to their old, familiar warmth and affection. This brief moment brought both a glimmer of hope and profound confusion to Jessica's heart. Her father looked at Jessica as if he had something he had wanted to say for a long time. His face took on the warm and protective expression she once knew, but this change was fleeting and fragile. In his eyes, there was a reflection of a message trying to reach Jessica, but the words seemed lost in the deep silence. This expression evoked a mixed emotion of hope and sorrow within Jessica. Here's the translation of the passage into English, while maintaining the integrity of the meaning. But Jessica didn't have enough time to fully comprehend the brief but meaningful gaze of the ghost. Her overwhelming fear and desire to escape took precedence. Her heart raced faster with each moment, and her breathing quickened. The looming threat of the other spirits behind the ghost distracted her, causing her to make panicked decisions. Suddenly, Jessica, without delving into the depths of her father's ghostly eyes, moved in a panic. The light of the gate contrasted sharply with the darkness waiting outside. Her vision blurred, and everything around her became indistinct. She ran towards the cemetery gate, feeling with every step that the dark and cold entities behind her were drawing closer. Finally reaching the gate, she threw herself into the darkness, breathless. The darkness settled over her like a somber shroud, but the light beyond the gate enveloped her with hope. As the gate closed behind her, the hum from the depths of the cemetery remained a silent echo. When Jessica reached the town, she could still hear the whispering voices of the ghosts in the cemetery. The sounds continued like a nightmare echoing in her mind. She writhed in sleeplessness at night, the cold and dark whispers of the ghosts invading her dreams. She felt a silent presence following her at every moment. It was as if the ghost's presence came with her with every step. As days passed, she adhered strictly to her decision never to return to the cemetery. Even looking towards the cemetery from her house's window, every morning and evening felt like a reminder of fear and anxiety. The townspeople noticed the change in Jessica's demeanor. Her face was pale, and her eyes constantly carried worry. However, Jessica didn't share her terror with anyone. She had to battle her inner fears alone. Yet, the unease and nightmares did not subside. Jessica feared that the ghost's anger and desire for revenge would never leave her alone. Her experience in the cemetery had taught her that the ghosts would not find peace until they exacted their revenge. The anger and pain she saw in the ghost's eyes remained a constant threat in her mind. One day, Jessica was certain that the ghosts would eventually find her. She had a constant sense that the fear she experienced in the old cemetery would one day become reality. At night, as she fell asleep, her heart raced when she saw a shadow in the dark corners. Jessica continued her search for both inner peace and external safety, but deep down, she knew that the darkness of the cemetery would one day find her.